Hello and welcome to the first episode of James Shows Darren Games. This is a little podcast / show where two friends get together every couple of weeks and we play some games and we chat about them.
That speaking is your host, James, and I'm Darren, the co-host, I guess. We just finished a game called A Way Out. Well, actually, just the first kind of sequence of it. And we're going to chat about how we felt about it.
Yeah, just a little bit of background. Darren and I have been friends for 20-ish years, I want to say now. Yeah,
so we started high school in 95, and we were closer friends like 1 or 2 years after that in grade 9. So we've been friends since then. I introduced this guy to who would be his future wife, who's his wife now, and I was best man at his wedding, and so we've got a pretty long history together.
And we have a common bond in video games, so something we always usually do when we get together is play some games. So let's chat about our first little impression a few hours in of A Way Out, which is a cooperative only game, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, we've played our fair share of co-op games in the past. We've played through a lot of Gears of War together, done a lot of fighting games together. We've played a lot of games, even solo, where one of us is kind of giving commentary while the other's playing. So it's not unusual for us to play a game sitting on the couch together. But to have a game that is made only for co-op play is something that we haven't seen a lot of for forever, I guess.
Yeah. And this game starts off, you get to select between Vincent or Leo. Vincent seems a bit more kind of in jail by kind of circumstances, whereas Leo seems the type of guy that was almost destined to end up in a place like that.
Sure.
And what was kind of your initial impressions?
Well, one of the things we actually talked about when we played was we get a really small introduction to these characters, and then we're tasked with choosing which character we're going to play. And what I found interesting was there wasn't anything about an individual character. Sure, there was some differences. They had a different voice. They looked different. And there was a little bit of, Leo's the guy that gets shit done, and Vincent is kind of more of a thinker's person. But there wasn't anything other than that stood out about a character, and either of us were like, I'll just pick based on what you pick. There wasn't anything that really grabbed me about the characters enough to say, oh, I gotta play this guy. And I would have really liked that at the initial choice. Short of, in other games, sometimes, you'll pick a character before you even do anything story-wise. So here we have an opportunity to be introduced to a character narratively, and then we get to pick. But I felt like it was a missed opportunity to make something of that character before we got to make the choice.
Yeah.
So that was my opinion.
Yeah, it does kind of jump you in blindly of, like, you get a little bit of flavor text, but beyond that, you don't really have an insight of who these characters actually are. Beyond that, Leo's kind of already in jail, where Vincent's kind of making his way in, and it's a very cinematic game.
Right.
In terms of what there is as a game, there isn't a ton to it. It reminds me a lot of kind of story-driven games that are more narrative focused, like Life is Strange or Heavy Rain.
I was thinking of both of those as well. How you have to make choices for the character that, in terms of interaction, are kind of irrelevant to the plot moving forward. Like, if I choose to talk to this person and then the choices I make in my character dialogue, that doesn't propel the narrative forward, but it's just giving you the option to interact as that character, as that avatar.
Yeah. But yeah, there was a fair share of QuickTime events.
For sure.
Which, they were done kind of in obvious ways. Like, there was a fight scene kind of at the beginning.
Right.
And it was very predictable, you know, press X at the right time to land a punch, and then Y to kind of counter an attack. So that was pretty obvious. Which, I guess, how else would you kind of do that mechanic?
Yeah, I think that was our first real introduction to using those QuickTime events, because up until that point we were walking through a set piece and talking to people and not really making a decision one way or the other of who we were, what we were doing, or the actions we were taking. And what was interesting, I think, about that for me was you mentioned the word cinematic, and I felt the same thing. But what changed in this is that both narratives were happening simultaneously. So this concurrent narrative that was happening at the same time, where we got to see both characters' perspectives. And in some ways that was really interesting. And at the same time, I wanted to, you know, get a visual. I wanted to keep looking at James's screen or you know, Leo's story. Yeah. To figure out, oh, what am I missing? Is there anything important about his character that I'm missing? And I haven't seen that a lot in cinema. There's been very few movies that have done the split screen stuff that happened with this concurrent narrative. And that was interesting to me. I liked seeing that. And moving into that QuickTime thing, that was our first experience with actual mechanisms in the game. And even then, it was press X before the timer runs out. Yeah. We talked about it later on in the game too, but everything was coming in these threes, right? So when we're fighting, we punch the guy 3 times, and then we do an evade move. And then we kick the guy and punch him 3 times, and then we do an evade move. And I just think that, I guess because we've seen the 3, you know, the 3 sequence so many times in games, I feel like there's room to change that expectation in a game that is very cinematic, like Life is Strange, right? Like Heavy Rain. Right? There's opportunities in that where you don't have to go through the game feel to get a feel of interacting with the character. And I'm not saying that that was a bad thing. I feel like in a game like this, there's so little required of us up to this point as players that I didn't feel that we needed to go through a big fight sequence to make us feel like we were interacting. I know from my walkthrough initially in the game, playing as Vincent, I'm not sure how it felt for Leo, because Leo was already in prison and Vincent is being introduced to it. I was trying really hard to provoke guards. My whole entrance into the prison, I walk in and I have to strip, and then I get showered, and then I grab my clothes and I walk in, and the warden introduces himself, and the warden essentially provokes one of the inmates to ask a question, and when he does, forces one of the guards to beat him. So we have this idea that, you know, this is a hard place and there's these moments, but there was nothing that I could do in that sequence to make a guard react to me other than to shoo me away with his hand. And I felt, again, visually and cinematically, that was another missed opportunity for them to push harder than they did. Because that opening sequence, we got in that fight eventually, but that I was already in prison by the time that happened. That was like the next day or the next sequence or whatever. I'm not sure how you felt being already in the prison and if that experience was different for you.
Well, I think with these type of games, they are very linear in fashion of like, you are kind of driven down this path of the story, and I guess I don't know how much work it would be to kind of add, you know, you bump into a guard and then maybe there's a confrontation there. But I do see how that, like, if this was a real world with a real setting and you've witnessed this happen to other prisoners, why isn't it happening
Sure.
to you.
Yeah.
Kind of does break that a bit of immersion. But yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, speaking of the shower sequence too, there's lots of dudes' butts, right? But we actually saw some male frontal nudity too, which in a video game, let alone a console video game, that's not something that happens all the time.
Yeah.
So for me, like, you know, we see that in movies and stuff like that from time to time, and still even in film, American film, whatever, North American film, it's not something that you see very often. I mean, I see it every time I take a shower, so you know, it's not a big deal for me. But at the same time, having that on the screen in a video game was actually, I think it was a new experience, if I'm being honest about it.
I think Grand Theft Auto 5 did a male frontal thing,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it was done kind of in jest.
Gotcha.
This was done as the guy's taking a shower and he turns slightly and there it is. And it wasn't done as a joke, or it was just
a normal
thing.
occurrence. Yeah. And I felt that in a way added to the weight of the sequence, because if I remember correctly, there was more focus, if you could say, on that sequence, even though it was still split screen, I think. But there was more focus at that time on Vincent than there was on Leo. Leo was kind of, you were like in an upper echelon of the prison and kind of looking down, waiting for Vincent to come out with all the other new inmates. So I think that kind of set a bit of a bar for how serious or how real that this story was going to be. And I think too that's, to me, that was in conflict with not being able to provoke a guard. Simply like with the guard, he'd push, some of the guards would push you away, and it was a very similar animation. But I think even just like, maybe, you know, third time's the charm in video games, right? But maybe you do it a third time and they pull out their club and just like throw a threat out there or something like that.
Right.
Just to add, again, that level of realness. And for the Vincent character, I'm actually in prison. Like, this is happening.
Yeah.
Right? So I think some of that was really compelling and really powerful in that way. In other ways, it was just, it was almost like a follow the dot sequence of me just walking from point A to point B to point C as I was introduced to this prison sequence. So
yeah, I mean, I think some of that is just limitations of probably development. I think it's a pretty small studio that worked on the game, and I'm sure they were kind of stretched for resources, but yeah, it's something that it kind of showed that, this is a game, and there are kind of those invisible walls that you hit. One thing I did like was the focusing of split screen, and when there was a kind of an important moment for one character versus the other, it would kind of take up more screen real estate.
Yes.
I thought that was interesting. The only downside of having this continuous split screen was if you would engage in dialogue at the same time. I did notice it kind of muffled one side of the dialogue.
That's right, yeah.
Which I don't know if it was trying to pick which side was more important.
I remember hearing that happen in other co-op games we've played when we're interacting at different times. Borderlands is one that jumps to mind. But when you are in your HUD in Borderlands, so like in your backpack and inventory system or whatever, it dulls the sounds from the other player, which I thought was an interesting way to do that. And I don't know if maybe it doesn't seem like it's a limitation of the system, because when you're live and you're shooting things and whatnot, you get sounds from both characters. So I'm not sure why they do that, but it seemed, again, in this particular sequence, if Vincent started talking and then Leo started talking, Vincent's dialogue would get muffled, and then Leo's would, because it was just the second one that took place. Or maybe I'm remembering that wrong. It was the reverse. But either way, once one was going, one of them would be muffled if you started up a second dialogue
So it was whatever the newest dialogue initiated would be the...
Because there'd be some voice sequences where one was muffled and then the other one would finish, and then the muffled one would come back to the front, even though it was still ongoing.
Yeah.
So, again, I'm not sure. I don't feel like that's a limitation of the system. I just feel like somewhere in there they just made the decision that we're going to give focus to one screen or the other, no matter whatever their algorithm is.
Yeah.
We're going to give focus and make one louder and muffle the other. So that was something that stood out for sure.
I usually play games with subtitles, so I think that was kind of helpful.
Sure.
In those situations, because you could read through the text, even if it was slightly muffled.
Right. Another thought I had on the narrative was one of the opening sequences, they're on an airplane together. And then after a bunch of stuff happens, there's one short sequence back on this airplane. And they're kind of jabbing at each other about whether Vincent helped out or not in that opening sequence that we played through. And I wasn't... If that continues and we keep jumping back to the airplane, then sure, that works, because what I see happening then is this prison sequence is then going to just fast forward maybe to that airplane sequence.
Right.
That's kind of how I see that going. But for the small bits that we saw the airplane sequence, I'm not sure if there was any value in going back there. Because we only jumped back once so far, and it was so small and so insignificant that I feel like we could have got more out of their characters just staying where we were instead of making that jump. I'm thinking about it particularly from a movie perspective, right? Where there's jump cuts and we change chronological order and we change the timing of when this thing happens in the real world. But that was something that I noticed.
Yeah, because all that airplane scene really tells you is they obviously managed to escape.
Right.
And they're on an airplane.
Sure.
Which... I don't think there was a need to really show that.
Sure.
Other than that character select screen at the beginning, but...
The only other thing that I'm thinking about is in terms of making something feel real, and specifically in terms of video games and some of the diversity that we see in bigger titles. Now, you're saying that this is a smaller studio, so assuming this isn't a AAA title, right? But both of us were still playing white dudes. And there's actually quite a few. There was some Hispanic people in the prison, and there was a lot of white folks in the prison. Not very many black folks. So I'm wondering if that was... We know, for example, that in the American prison system, there's overpopulation when it comes to black folks because of a lot of the situations that it's just this nasty cycle, right?
Right.
And that's not the prison that we were looking at in this game when we interacted with even the people that were that we got into fights with, the people that we were talking to. I think there was one black guy who we actually had conversation with, and he helped us get into a certain place and get the thing we needed, and then we passed it off to him and he helped us later.
Which I kind of wondered, well, wouldn't that guy just use that object for himself?
Sure.
Instead of passing it on, but
right. In terms of like a plot hole or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. So, I don't know, that was something that stood out to me. I've been thinking about diversity a lot in games in particular, and how we present people of color, and if we present people of color. And I know you had your Drive Talk episode that talked about privilege and things like that. So it was just something that was top of mind for me, realizing that we're coming into this playing two white guys, and how that fits with us being on the couch together, how we personify ourselves in an in-game avatar, and the decision from a developer's perspective to say that, yeah, these are the two characters and these are their stories and things like that. So it was something I'm interested to see where that goes, and how we know from a little bit of the back and forth between Vincent and Leo that there's one character, Henry or Harry or something like that, that has Harvey, maybe.
Because, that was something that I was kind of questioning, well, why is Vincent helping Leo out so much in the beginning? Like, what is his motive for... Like, there was a few scenes where Leo's in trouble with this Russian Hulk of a guy, and Vincent kind of comes to his aid, and it's like, well, why are you doing this? And then it's kind of revealed that there's something, a bond between them of this guy that they both kind of want dead.
Right.
As far as, I mean, I'll give video games a little bit of a pass because it's a relatively new medium when you compare it to, say, film.
Sure.
In terms of diversity. I mean, the Mexican guy you bump, or a couple of guys you bump into, are very stereotypical. Very much a caricature of that culture. So maybe that was a little tone deaf, in my opinion. But yeah, I think I tend to give video games a little bit of a pass. But there is definite room for improvement.
Sure. Yeah, all things considered, I'm interested in, playing through another session. I'm interested in seeing what these characters have to offer in terms of their character development and their narrative. And the mechanics, because it is a narrative game and they're trying to fit in ways for us to interact with the buttons on our controller. Coming from playing Life is Strange and games like that, I don't expect much more than we've already been introduced to. I don't expect much more in terms of that. I will say that some of the, if you could call them puzzles, are pretty linear so far. And I'm not sure if that is still part of the introduction of the game and part of the opening tutorial, because there isn't a tutorial. It's just, we just get dropped in and interact with the controller to make decisions. So without that, maybe these sequences that we've done so far are still relatively light in terms of mechanics. Yeah,
it definitely seems very basic at this kind of beginning point. I hope they do kind of expand a bit more in the problem solving. I think the most fun moment was there was a scene where you're kind of breaking out of your cell and you kind of have to keep watch. Your cells are kind of side by side, and there's this corridor where the guards are kind of walking back and forth, and you're keeping watch while the other player is kind of chiseling his way out of the cell. And I found that a fun, tense kind of moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think there was a lot of... both of us were doing different things mechanically, and both of us were focusing on different things visually on the screen. And that what the one person was doing was going to be directly related to what the other person was doing as the lookout, which meant that there was a forced interaction between us on the couch, also between the characters on the screen, and the tension was high because we know that in this game, we're not going to die if we get found out. We're just going to reset. And we did hit a point where we did just reset, but that tension is still high because from a game perspective, we don't know how far we get and how far back we have to reset. So how much of the sequence do you want to play over and over and over again?
Yeah.
That's always a consideration when you're doing sequences like that, is how much do you force the players, when they make a mistake, to repeat the same content. I think if that was harder for whatever reason, there was some pretty big gaps between the guards watching versus how fast it was to make yourself look like you were not doing anything.
Yeah.
And that was a really fast sequence, which meant that we had a pretty high margin of error. I wonder what it would look like if that was smaller, or if when we got found out, we went right back to the start and we got found out more often or something like that. I think that could get frustrating, but I think they had a good, whether it was from playtesting or whatever, but I think they had a good feel for that sequence, and that's why it felt good to us, and it felt tense, and it didn't feel belabored, because we were doing different things the whole time.
And I think maybe that's one of the challenges of these type of games. If you make them too hard and there's too many fail states, you kind of lose that momentum in the narrative. Even some of the more traditional single player games, it always kind of grinds my gears, so to speak, when there's a huge story piece that's kind of unraveling and you die a few times, and it's like the momentum of that story, everything that's kind of led up to this point is now losing its momentum because you're dying.
Sure.
Instead of kind of seeing it through in one kind of swoop.
Right. That reminds me of you talking about Far Cry 5 last time, and how a fail state in that, what you thought as a gamer was a fail state, actually propelled the narrative forward, and it was a necessary point in the fiction that you had to go through.
Yeah.
And until you did that, number one, as soon as you did that, you thought, oh, I've got to do this over. And then the reveal of, no, this is what needed to happen. That was a talking point for us last time as well. So I would like to see that more. Coming from a role-playing background, that's something that you can do in a role-playing tabletop game, because you have control over that narrative, versus playing through a sequence that's already crafted or scripted by a developer. But I like the idea of failing forward.
Yeah.
And having, even in combat, I think we did the fight sequence in this game pretty much perfect. I don't think either of us screwed up, because it was we had a lot of time to enter the correct buttons.
Yeah. And it was only 2 buttons too, right?
Yeah, exactly. They didn't throw, the kitchen sink at us in that sequence. It was pretty straightforward. But again, as somebody interested in the experience, especially from the fail perspective, there's a number of times where I wanted to see what would happen if I screwed up, but I didn't, if that makes sense. And I'm not sure if that's just the way that I like to interact with games, or if you do something similar, but I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't punch the guy, or I wanted to see what happened, like I said earlier, if I just kept trying to provoke a guard, right? But maybe that's just my perspective.
Yeah, and maybe the developers that accounts for 2% of the player base that try to poke the holes, but I do see your point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just, for example, let's say if in the fight sequence, because I was thrown in the ring once Vincent was thrown in the ring once Leo was already getting beaten up.
Yeah.
For whatever reason. And then I have to start fighting guys too. But I wonder, when I played it perfectly. I didn't miss a button. I did it on purpose to play through to get to the next stage. Because as the narrative was going, I was very uninterested in the fight. I was interested in the outcome of the fight. But I didn't at that point just put the controller down and see what would happen. And I'm just interested from a development perspective, because then you would have to script more stuff. You would have to develop more game in order to have fail states in there. And I'm interested as a designer, I'm interested in it as a creator myself. What does it look like when the person just puts the controller down and says, no, I'm not going to punch this dude?
Right.
So, not something I can figure out immediately, but still interested.
For sure. Any other thoughts or comments?
What did you think of the voice actors?
It was, yeah, I would say it was kind of above the average or above par of what a typical video game voice acting would be.
Okay.
The graphics were a little rough in spots. But I think like the way kind of the camera work was done and the subtle music and the voice acting, it kind of tied everything together.
Right.
And I think it's one of those things where I wouldn't say it's stellar, but I wouldn't say it's terrible.
Right.
But it is kind of a notch above.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, for me, I felt the quality level across the board was pretty high. So that's why when you said, I think it's a small studio, I was like, oh, that's interesting, because I was impressed with it, seeing, like, I know the world building is not like I saw in Far Cry 5, for example. It doesn't have that same engine running it.
Yeah.
But it still looked good, and it still, it had a realistic feel to it, even though, you know, these characters aren't jumping out of the screen as like some of the models that I've seen in the past. But I felt like, and this is probably coming from a game like Life is Strange, which in my opinion had really amazing voice actors.
Yeah.
This to me felt a little bit uninspired.
It's a pretty generic tale thus far.
Sure.
I'm interested to see where it's going to go. But yeah, it is almost kind of a cliche tale of two guys, you know, busting out of jail.
Right.
Which is what we did. But
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, we'll see what happens next, and whether we get through the end or not, I guess, is time will tell.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested enough to keep playing. Which, there's that, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, if the question is, in this game, would you keep playing? And the answer is yes. Like, I think that's what the developers want, right? They want you to feel like, I came into this game only seeing the trailer, so it's meeting my expectations from what I saw in the trailer, and I'm willing to give it more of my attention, more of my time. So I think that's a good thing overall. And as I said earlier, a lot of my complaints were things that go over and above the core of the game. They're like, this is how I feel the characterization could be better, or this is how I might improve some of the voice acting, or some of the narrative sequence, or the we talked about the realness of some of the situations. Yeah. But those are all over and above the core elements of the game that I think are quite strong. I think it still presents pretty high quality, in my opinion.
And do you think this game at all could work as a single player game? I don't think there is any way to really do that. Like, I don't think you could switch between characters. Like, I think what makes this game is the fact that it's pure co-op.
Right. I think that is its hook, for sure. Because, like you said, I don't think it's the story that's necessarily the hook for us. We've seen this kind of narrative before. But I think that...
Oh, sorry, my phone is buzzing here.
All right. I think that looking at what some of the game does and what other games have done in the co-op space, where I'm remembering there's a Resident Evil game that was co-op as well.
Revelations,
yeah. And there wasn't the same kind of cinematic interactivity like we have in this game, but even still, you could jump in and jump out as the co-op, because they had an AI to run your partner. And granted, in that game, there was less mechanically, like they had the combat sequence and then moving, and maybe you'd pull a switch or you'd open a door kind of thing. But I feel like in some sequences, you could write an AI to do some of the things that your partner needed to do, providing that you were playing the lead actor in those sequences, right? For example, when we were on the roof that's being tarred, I was the one that got boosted up to climb up, to get the thing, to find a way back down, to go through. If that, to me, that felt like the lead actor in that point. And your response in that was to distract the guard at one key point and to open the door at the other key point, or break the lock so that I could get out. And I feel like an AI could either handle those sequences, or you could swap back and forth. I think there definitely need be more development in that, especially with the AI. AIs can't be easy to code, especially in a game that has some of these sequences which aren't timed, which don't have like this pre-built framework around how you do a sequence. So yeah, but that's an interesting perspective for sure.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that'll conclude the first episode.
Yeah, the inaugural episode
of what are we calling this thing again?
Well, we don't have a name as of yet, but I've enjoyed the title James Shows Darren Games.
So we'll run with that for now, and we'll be back soon to do another one of these. Maybe we'll chat more about this game, or maybe we'll try something else.
For sure.
All right.
Say goodnight, James.
Good night.